Hello, everyone. So I still remember when exactly 3 years ago, at our annual conference in Warsaw 2018, we started discussing on how two networks such as EVPA and EFC, the European Foundation Center, could have collaborated to bring value to those foundations already exploring or interested in exploring the continuum of capital, going beyond grant making. And I remember that one of the options we put on the table to discuss with the group of foundations that were in the room was do nothing. And today, after 3 years, I'm very glad to tell you that do nothing was not the answer that foundations gave us. So I'm Alessia Gianoncelli, Head of Knowledge, Community and Market Development at EVPA. And today I'm here with my colleague from EFC, Anna Surmaz, Enabling Environment Manager, to introduce you some of the distinguished members of our initiative foundations along the spectrum of capital. So the idea behind this group was to create a safe space where foundations could have discussed their strategies and processes, their challenges and best practices to stimulate peer learning and foster collaboration. The questions we discussed, for example, the first year during the free physical gatherings we had, were what was the rationale behind going beyond grant making? Do you have a separate legal structure to manage your investment activities? What are the implications that each financial instrument has on the way you select and manage investees? But also, does the financial instruments have an impact on the duration of your commitment, investment process, exit strategies, and vice versa? Which are the elements that have an influence on choosing a certain instrument rather than another? The stage of development, the business model of the social purpose organizations, the investment sector. And also, we wanted to know if there were any issue in terms of governance while deploying multiple financial instruments. And then we wanted to know whether the teams deploying these instruments were communicating among themselves, and if yes, why, how, and if no, why. And then we also wanted to understand whether foundations were investing in existing impact funds and what was the rationale behind investing in external vehicles instead of creating impact funds. And last but not least, we wanted to explore the necessary conditions that would have made foundations consider to invest their endowments with social purposes. But then there was COVID. So everything changed, and not just the way in which we used to organize our initiative gatherings, but also the topics to discuss. But this privileged setting gave us the possibility to discuss how and if the COVID crisis has impacted the way in which foundations act. So today, we're going to give you some insights on this topic, and thus it's a pleasure to have with us our members of the initiative. So welcome to Bo Ancilla, Impact Investment Manager and Foundations from the Netherlands. Francisco Palmares, despite the name, Project Manager at Calouste Gulbenkian Foundations from Portugal. Marco Gerevini, Managing Director at Fondazione Housing Sociale, Board Member of Fondazione Social Venture Giordano dell'Amore from Italy. And last but not least, Markus Lux, Senior Vice President Global Issues at Robert Bosch Foundations from Germany. So welcome everyone and thank you to be here today. So I remind the audience that there is the possibility to ask questions to our panelists, and you can write your questions in the chat. And at the end, Hannah will moderate a Q&A moment in which we can address your inquiries. But let's start from the first statement that we would like to test with our panelists today. So, statement number one. COVID has changed the dynamics of the relationship that foundations have with their stakeholders. But is this true? Did something change in the way foundations deal with their grantees or their investees, but also with the public sector? So I would like to give Francisco from Gulbenkian the floor so that he can share with us his insights on this statement.
Thank you very much, Alessia. Thank you for having me in this session, and just like to give a warm welcome to my fellow colleagues and to those watching us at home or in the office. And going straight away to your question, yes, I think it's obvious that COVID had a big impact on how we relate with our stakeholders, grantees, investees, but even the public sector, as you said. And I think it's clear for everyone. Basically, COVID aggravated some of the social problems that vulnerable groups, some specific vulnerable groups were feeling. I'm thinking about like the elderly, kids without access to technology, and it showed us that the best way to 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 deal with this pandemic was to show flexibility with the organizations we support, either with grants or with investment, because they're the ones that are on a day-to-day basis working with these vulnerable groups, and even they weren't sure about how they would deal with the pandemic because they had to repivot their intervention. Most of them were working on an offline basis, and suddenly they had no contact whatsoever with their beneficiaries. So there, it was a huge task for them and for us also, and the only solution was to provide flexibility, to be patient, and I think it showed the importance of being core funders, of unrestricted funding, because it was the only way these organizations would be able to overcome the restrictions imposed by COVID. Just a small uh, feedback on the public sector and the role they had, because they were our partners throughout the pandemic. We launched several emergency funds, and they were our partners in most of them, financially and technically. But I think the main problem we're feeling right now is that this short-term commitment uh, hasn't already become a long-term commitment. Like we're talking, we're still unsure about how the public sector will involve civil society, how it will involve foundations in designing the future of impact, of innovation, with the help of these EU funds that will for sure mark the next 10 years. So I think these two couple of statements are our position on the relationship with our stakeholders.
Thank you, Francisco. And Juan, do you mind to give us the perspective of Doom Foundation as well?
Of course, thank you, Alessia. And I'm sorry, because it might not be so interesting for the debate on this panel, but I have to say that I agree with Francisco. And I'd like to add to it. So besides flexibility, I also think that trust and speed are things that change the dynamics of how Doom works with their stakeholders going forward due to the COVID situation. So, for example, when the first lockdown hit us, Doom started immediately working on something to help our main stakeholders, which is our partners, so the grantees and also the companies that receive impact investment from the Doom Foundation. And we started setting up a relief fund. We immediately saw that what these companies needed was speed, because in the Netherlands we're fortunate enough that even the government was able to help some small companies, but it took time, right? It took maybe 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, and some companies didn't have that time because the impact was so severe. So we immediately reshaped our application process for this relief fund, financing mostly based on trust. So in order to keep the speed and to help really fast, we said, if you are a grantee of the Doom Foundation, we already know you, we have a good relationship. So we're not going to do the DD all over again. Just tell us what you need, and on a case-by-case basis, we will look what kind of financing we can provide you to overcome these challenges that you see. And I think in summary, that indeed what was mentioned earlier, flexibility, speed and trust are things that already were in the field, but of course became extra important during the first lockdown and thereafter. So I do think the dynamics has changed, but for the positive.
Thank you, Boan. And maybe now Marcus to share the point of view of Bosch Foundation.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. And I tried to bring, I also could agree with Boan and Francisco, but I would like to bring in maybe a different perspective. For me, the whole COVID situation is very much about uncertainty. And this uncertainty is something which experience this uncertainty in our own organization means above all that we as a foundation, which are usually in a relatively stable state, suddenly find ourselves in the situation in which our partners and grantees often find themselves. Uncertainty, what happens next, what could be next. This creates humility and respect, hopefully on our side, but also a lot of uncertainty, for example, in our teams. So we at the Bosch Foundation were at the beginning of 2020 in a very intensive and long-going strategy development process. And the first reaction of the colleagues, before I talk about the grantees, was a protective and security reflex in the teams. So the first reaction was, let's stop the strategy development process and devote all resources to emergency aid, for example. But as ridiculous as it may sound, we first had to convey the employees that global challenges such as climate change and inequalities won't disappear because of the pandemic, but will come to light much more clearly than before. Regarding uncertainty, I at least saw some challenges in the global sector. We saw also in the public sector. It was a relapse into national mindsets and in a way an egocentric behavior. So, for example, the closing of the borders within the European Union. No common agreements between Germany, Poland, and France. They simply closed the borders. And I saw a similar, I would really call it egocentric behavior also within foundations. We were focusing very much on our own grantees, but it was, for example, in Germany, impossible to create a pooled fund, a pooled emergency fund, and between the foundations. The same on the European level. There were some pool funds, but they were really small. And actually, if you see the size of these pool funds, it was a shame if this is the reaction of the foundations. And the uncertainty about our own role. For example, the German government, at that time, the Minister of Finance, Olaf Scholz, which might become the new chancellor, mentioned, I will take out the bazooka. And the German government offered 500 billion euro emergency aid. Of course, Boan, you're right. It was with delay, but nevertheless, 500 billion. The public sector showed it could deliver if it had to. And we foundations with our small million budgets were relatively small. And this is something which also brought us into an uncertainty because we were always thinking about cross-sector alliances and these things. And suddenly we have to admit that our millions won't make the difference when the state, the public sector is acting well. The very last remark, what we did, we are not famous for emergency aid in the Bosch Foundation. We switched all our existing grants to unrestricted grants to support our existing grantees in the severe situation. And we did it, this was more than 780 grants within 2 weeks. So this was our contribution to the situation.
Thank you so much, Marcus, for this perspective and also for discussing this point on the potential of the public sector. And I think that here again, flexibility, trust, speed, giving unrestricted and patient capital, it's really the answer. But let's test the second statement then. So after all these new things or revised things that you did, foundations are going back to normal. But is this true? So will the changes foundations adopted to face the COVID pandemic remain in the future foundation practice? So Marcus, if you can continue and elaborate on this statement.
Yes, of course. And it's again about uncertainty because this is a question for, I don't know, the midterm future. So the numbers of incidences are rising again in Europe. We have again countries in lockdown, for example, in the Baltic states. It's hard to look in the midterm or far away future. Back to the normal. I think the problem is, again, I will be critical, and maybe my successors in this board, in this panel, are more optimistic. I think people tend to revert to old patterns of behavior. So why shouldn't organizations do the same? We saw this 2008-9 during the economic and financial crisis, when we talked about there has to be restrictions for the banking sector, never should this happen again. And 1 year later, it was the same bonus payments as 2 years before. So therefore, I'm a bit skeptical on this. On the other hand, we learned some things. For the Bosch Foundation, for example, I told you about the unrestricted funding, something which wasn't almost impossible to think of before, and now it has become our standard tool. And we are also, as a result of the learnings from the COVID-19 pandemic, we think about new funding instruments or funding tools, especially to keep our grantees more sustainable in all three sectors of sustainability. I think we, for example, we would invest much more money in organizational development as we did before. This is one lessons learned, and this is something we also have for the future. The interesting thing is, 1 year ago, it was clear to us as a company affiliate foundation, we would simply experience the crisis in civil society ourselves a year later. Namely, if the dividend in the following year would be significantly lower than we had planned. And so it happened for us. And this is now the challenge for us, that we, 1 year later, are in a similar situation to our grantees, with uncertainty about our funds. We have much bigger plans than we now could fulfill, and this is something that the crisis hit the philanthropic sector only 1 year later, and this is something we have to deal with. I don't have an answer on this question at the very moment. Of course, we have to focus on the aims and be much more strict in our funding and grant making and investment, but it will be a challenge. And this is something I also see in the next years, and this might be also have an influence on the whole philanthropic sector.
Thank you so much, Marcus. And now maybe Marco, I can give you the floor for the first time, if you can also elaborate on this statement about foundations going back to normal. You are muted, Marco.
Okay, sorry. Thank you, Alessia, and good morning to everyone. Yes, I think the foundations, the word foundations, foundation means many different entities, with different missions, different business models. Today in this panel, we have foundations with such different various origin and approaches. And within our family, we have grant making foundation, impact investing foundation. So the word foundation means many things. But as far as the big Italian philanthropic foundations are concerned, in our experience, the statement is not true. And talking about Fondazione Cariplos, but also about the other major Italian banking foundations. We are not going back to normal, at least for few things. our experience as Fondazione Cariplo, we reshaped our philanthropic priorities and activities to respond to the crisis. So basically relocating 60 million of grants devoted to address the emergency needs. And then also in the planning of the activity, we started to prioritize the areas of intervention and the areas most affected by the crisis. And basically creating two different actions. One which is more short-term, immediate, to support third sector organizations to answer to the needs and to tackle in particular child poverty, health, nutrition, and access to education during the pandemic. And then medium long-term actions basically to support the organization to rethink their business models, their tools to support social cohesion and all the business models active in culture, environment, welfare, and research. This is allowing the grant making foundation to grant for the next year 150 million of grants, but and this is the big first effect of the pandemic, extremely coordinated with the National Recovery and Resilience Plan based on EU resources approved by the Italian government back in July this year. And so the activity of the foundation is mirroring this plan, and this is mainly because of the reason that Marcus was mentioning, because the public sources have such a huge impact that what we can do is to help them to be a bridge between this huge amount of resources and our territories, our communities. And this is why we are strongly coordinating with these government measures. Then another change, or I think we reinforced a lot the approach driven by KPI. So we defined also for the grant making activities KPI ex ante and measurement instruments ex post to try to boost the effectiveness of the interventions. And of course, I agreed also with Boan's and Francisco's considerations around the flexibility, the quickness. We learn to be extremely fast in the process of giving grants to the organizations. For the first time in our history, we increased a lot the percentage of advance payment compared to the reimbursement ex post. So with the same approach based on trust, but also really to dedicate and concentrate resources in the areas we consider to be priority areas, and so in the organization to the organizations working in that area. And this has to remain to keep the effectiveness of the grant making activity. Last, also because of our activity also in the impact investing space, we boosted the development of the full spectrum of financial instruments beside the grants. In our case, through Fondazione Social Venture Giordano dell'Amore. So this pandemic period allowed us to accelerate in all these approaches. Now you are mute, Alessia. Sorry.
No, so since you mentioned the impact measurement and management, I just want to tell the participants that we are going to have a session on that at 1 o'clock. So you can come and join us. But again, Marcus, since you were referring to these impact investing activities and grant making activities, maybe I can start with you to test the third and last statement of today. So the crisis has impacted differently the capacity of delivering impact investing instruments compared to grant making. But is this true? So has the crisis shown particular advantages or maybe disadvantages of impact investing instruments over grant making? So over to you again, Marco.
Okay, thank you. As we said, during the pandemic, it was crucial to act fast and also the materiality of the help is crucial. So it has to be significant, the help, not just nice to have or marginal. And so also the concentration of resources to the real point, the most fragile organizations in the right sectors was crucial. And I think that in the most urgent phase of the crisis, grant has shown to be more effective because quicker to deliver, and this is the condition. So most effective if coupled with an efficient and fast release, not with the often usual cumbersome processes and very slow processes that we witness. In the medium and long term, I think that this is different, and I think that impact investing instruments could have a more effective result because they are designed to assist social enterprises to reinforce their capital and therefore attract also other sources of capital, debt instruments. They, being the impact investing instruments, they also increase the impact awareness of the organization and the centrality of impact measurement. Often we see that grants are linked to projects whereby impact investing resources are more often at corporate level, so with a different approach, with the participation in the governance that stimulates confrontation, generation of ideas and solution, and could allow also the involvement of new competencies from different backgrounds, enriching also the ability of the organization to find new solutions. And also to contribute, I think this is a period of great complexity, and this enrichment of the governance, of the involvement of new competencies could allow and contribute to the governance of complexity. But I think it's crucial to offer the full spectrum of financial instruments, from grant to equity to convertibles to guarantee funds, pay by results, and also all kind of grants. There are not only plain grants, but also dissolvable, recoverable grants. Dome Foundation has got a strong experience in that. Impact grants, and together also with a full spectrum of contractual terms and conditions. There are not only financial instruments, there are also legal conditions and clauses that allow long-term views. So the difference is the very long-term view, and also impact-driven business models. This is allowed by these instruments without compromising always the balance between the risk and the financial return. So I think that's the big difference and the advantage or disadvantage of the two instruments.
Thank you, Marco. And since I know that Dawn deploys lots of different financial instruments, I would like to give the floor to Boan now, so she can also give us her perspective on this statement.
Thank you, Alessia. Yeah, so indeed, like you mentioned and like Marco mentioned, I think foundations are many different things, and that's also the case for Doen. So we support pioneers who have a green, social, or a creative idea, which also means that we're financing projects, but business models in different phases of developing. And we believe that there's various reasons to choose for a different instrument, which depends on many things that should be viewed on a case-by-case basis. When we look at, for example, our relief fund and the COVID situation, that is how we continue to work, because we feel that that's the most effective way to always assess the circumstances of the company or the project that you're trying to finance. So what are the stakeholders? What is the signal to the market? Maybe giving an investment signals a very positive sign to other investors, enabling more impact investments throwing in. Or maybe the situation is so critique that actually a grant is the most effective way, like Marco also already mentioned, on the short term. So really, we studied on a case-by-case basis what actually the company needed, and we decided to be flexible. So it could be a loan with a 0% interest, or if we could charge an interest and make sure that others were also providing loans because of that, that might be the wise idea. So to summarize and answer your question, I do not think that impact investing or impact investments are a preferred way in these situations compared to grants, but I really think it depends on the situation of the company that you're financing.
Thank you so much, Boan. And this is exactly how we define tailored financing as concept as a VPA. So it resonates a lot. And then I would like to move then to Francisco, so that he can also give us the perspective of Gulbenkian Foundation on this topic.
Yeah, I won't add that much. I think we're very aligned, and well, it's the title of the group, right? The foundations along the spectrum of capital, and I think our perspective is very similar. So grants and impact investing should work in a complementary way, and they serve different purposes, maybe different audiences sometimes, and they can solve different problems. So it's hard to have a stance on which is better. And I also think I agree with Marco with what he said about the grants. Like at the beginning of the crisis, I think it was easier to work with grants because they might work a bit more on emergency, and they're also a bit less complex, and it's basically a two-sided relationship between foundation and social organization, whereas in like social impact bonds or other investment instruments, you can have third parties involved, and that might make it a bit more complex. So I think grants were very helpful at the beginning, and basically I think the pandemic brought the best out of foundations and of the other stakeholders as well. So I think that was the main note on the pandemic. So we have no reasons to complain from both grantees, investees, and the public sector. As Marco said, they show that foundations can be insignificant in terms of the amount of money they have. I think we have a duty of thought leadership and of risking before the governments. Like yesterday, we had here a presentation of Ubuntu Academy. They're this like non-formal leadership program, And basically, we started supporting them with a grant in 2010. And 11 years after, I think because the pandemic showed the lack of skills that kids are developing in school, yesterday the public sector committed to making this a public policy. So it took 11 years. It's a long way to go, but I think both instruments should work along the life cycle of an organization. They can serve different purposes, and talking a bit more specifically about the investments, what I think the pandemic showed was a huge opportunity to invest. Our fund, the fund we launched with Maze, made most of its investments during the pandemic, because I think the pandemic showed there's this economic opportunity in solving social and environmental problems. But also on the other side, obviously, there's a lot of uncertainty. As Marcus said, foundations are also feeling it nowadays. So it's on a case-to-case basis, like Boan said, and it's hard to be on one side of the barricade.
No, thank you so much, and that's great, because this is exactly what we wanted to hear. So I think I'll hand over to Hannah so we can continue with the Q&A session. So I'll mute myself now for real. And over to you, Anna.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Alessia, and all of the panelists for a great discussion so far and interventions. So we have received, and my name is Hannah Sommerts from the European Foundation Center, and we are organizing this group together as EFC and EVPA. So very happy to be here with this co-organized session. And we want to make it as interactive as possible. And we have already received some interesting questions in the chat, a little bit more around the technicalities potentially, how indeed some of the instruments that are put in place through the impact investing side and the grant making side, how technically that works, and how you can keep the flexibility and focus if the grant making and the impact investing are organized in separate funds or in separate tools. I do not know whether that applies to all of you, but maybe those who feel that they can answer this question could speak up and come in at this moment.
I would be happy to answer the question, or go first at least.
Yes, please, go ahead.
Please, panelists, feel free to add me where I miss out, or if you have a different view. So first of all, maybe the question around technicality, what instruments are we talking about? Personally, for the Doen Foundation, we work with grants, convertible grants, loans, convertible loans, and equity, and everything that falls between that. So we try to be also quite innovative ourselves when it comes to financing. And the way we try to keep that flexibility is putting our partner central. So indeed, we have one impact investment arm and a grant arm at the Doen Foundation, but we always work together in teams where we discuss the applicants that we receive. And so we start with the company or the partner itself, and then look what instrument would be most suitable. And then it's dependent on that question, which team will follow on with the certain partner. Also, always working in pairs. So we always have combined teams to assess these questions, because indeed we feel it's so important to have that knowledge sharing also on the technical knowledge about the fields that you're operating in, as well as the technical knowledge about the instruments that you're using. So maybe I hope that answers your question, Eva, and otherwise happy to elaborate.
Great, thank you. And maybe just a quick follow-up question to this, because we heard from some of you that the grant making activity has potentially played a more important role in the beginning of the pandemic, whereas you sense that in the medium term, indeed, the impact investment tools are picking up and are potentially playing an equal role or even more strategic role in this. The way you organize it, has that changed during the pandemic? Has there been increased collaboration between the two arms of your setup?
To be completely honest, no, because we were already working that way. And also I think, therefore, for Doen, we also didn't lean towards grants in the beginning, because we felt we continued working in that way. The thing that we really changed is that normally as an investment manager, we would write a proposal. And now we turned it around. So basically asking the applicants to write, why they would need what, and we could assess it. So that gave us a lot of speed and flexibility. And we were able to implement that quite fast because we had a partnership with the Open Road Alliance, which is a foundation in the US. And they finance what they call oh my God situations. So they try to make impact by financing situations that nobody could have foreseen. And we had a partnership with them a few years back. So we learned what it was and what it took to really respond fast and apply the best way financial instruments possible. And that was also why we were able to quite fast iterate to the new situation while keeping on our standard way of working.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I think that's clear. And then I see that Marco, you want to come in on this point as well about the different...
Yes, because we have a slightly different model, but let's say with the same final result, in the sense that we have two different bodies, completely separate, also in terms of decision process, between the grant-making foundation and the impact investing one. And since we are much more focused on equity and equity-wise, equity-like instruments, so we don't give debt. So we give equity, convertible, let's say mezzanine, but not debt. So we enter into the governance of the organizations in different ways, always minority shareholder. The application to these two different instruments is very different. So you answer to calls when you are looking for grants, and you are channeled into the grant-making team's analysis, whereby if you apply for an equity investment, you are directed to another team. Then we talk to each other, but there are two completely separate processes, and we find sometimes, not often, but sometimes to invest in organizations which in the past received grants from the grant-making foundation, from Fondazione Carito. But this doesn't affect the decision-making processes. So we are coordinated but separate in these terms.
Thank you, Marco and Boan. Indeed, I think already those two interventions reveals that indeed foundations are a very diverse universe. So indeed, if you know one foundation, you know one foundation, because indeed the approaches also when it gets to operating, grant making versus impact investing, how you set it up, how indeed you bring the different teams together. There are very different approaches, and it's indeed something where this group in particular, the joint EFC EVPA group, plays a crucial role in enabling also the exchange of all these different approaches in this regard. So yeah, now I think I would like to come back to also one of the questions Jane Newman asked in the chat. That is indeed, it's great to hear about the flexibility and the flexible responses and approaches of the foundations here, also and the panelists in the room. But they wanted to hear from you if there have been any constraints of dealing with it, and how we can potentially, or you can better prepare for the future or another crisis to ensure that maybe there are legal governance changes to be able to respond even more effectively. And that in a way looks ahead also a little bit into the role that the foundations can play in the recovery phase, and what is then needed in a way to keep some of the new approaches, new responses, the more flexibility that you gained in this momentum. And is there anything that you consider is needed from your perspective also keep the different toolbox approaches open. And I would like to maybe invite Francisco on this point.
Sure, thank you, Hannah. I think I don't know if we can be even more flexible or fast than we were in March 2020. I think we started working remotely relatively late, I think mid-March, and by the end of March, beginning of April, we were already deploying funds to organizations. So for our standards, this was very, very fast. And I think it was basically because we were able to work in a collaborative way as we never were before. And maybe going back to the point on how foundations will be in the future, I don't know if we'll be able to replicate that collaboration. It was very demanding, because we have very different types of programs giving out grants. That was the main instrument we used in that emergency moment. So we were all working together to promote calls, as Marco said, and I think the foundation was basically working at 150%. So I think it's not easy to improve on that, but we had some learnings, like improving some legal demands and trying to make it a leaner process. I think that helped because we're obviously also a very traditional foundation. And I think this is also an implication of COVID for everyone. It forced us to become a bit more new age, a bit more in line with millennials and a younger generation. And I think our processes were also a bit improved, mostly legal governance in terms of decision making and decision speed. And I'm still unsure of how that will remain in the future, but I'm sure this next year will give us the answers we need.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Francisco. And indeed, some of the governments or the authorities have also shown to be rather flexible in their approach. And that's something was also revealed by an EFC survey that we did among our membership, where indeed some of the foundations reported that they were engaging also with the supervisory authorities or fiscal authorities in a way to reach to this more flexibility, because sometimes the laws are more restrictive, but during the pandemic phase, the authorities themselves were a bit more flexible. And of course, it will be an interesting question to see what of this will remain in the future, and if this will potentially also change the relationship indeed with some of the authorities. And I would like to hand over back also to Marcus from Robert Bosch Foundation, because you made earlier on a statement about also the role and the relationship with the government, since indeed the government funding is quite substantial, and that this also led to an own self-reflection process in terms of the role of foundations. So maybe you can elaborate a little bit more what you see there in terms of future perspective and the role of foundations in the recovery phase.
Yeah, so to answer also Jane's question about the situation in the future, 4 bullet points. First, I hope that we won't face a similar situation in the future again. I think this is the very first thing. The second one is, the second bullet point is more internally about the organization. For example, at the Bosch Foundation, we don't do any impact investment, also due to the legal restrictions, but we have different tools, loans and all the other things, but we are not aware of this. So how could we give advice to our grantees and partners if we are not aware of the possibilities we have? So I think there's still a lack of knowledge, and this is something we have to change. And maybe there's a similar situation in other foundations. Thirdly, I think a challenge for us in the philanthropic sector was at the beginning of the crisis, and it's still until today, that we didn't have this transparency in this kind of exchange in between us. So there were such a huge amount of activities. I was responsible at the Bosch Foundation for an overview, but I stopped it in June 2020 because I had more than 80 groups on this in the philanthropic sector in Germany, in the state of Baden-Württemberg, in globally and in European wide. And actually, we really should use the modern technologies to make this more accessible and transparent for the future, and exchange and learn from each other. And the last point is about the legal things. This is to make a long story short, we need a European law on philanthropy, because the restrictions we have in Germany, for example, for impact investing, makes it so difficult in comparison with the Netherlands or Belgium, for example, to act similar and to learn more from each other and to act together. And this would be, for me, the first step of also cross-sectoral collaboration. Coming back to the origin by your question, Hannah, I think we are lost if we only talk about the national frameworks and the corporations. They are so different. The German government has the money. Other governments in Europe maybe don't have this amount of money. Yeah. So and therefore we have to step really a step higher on the European level. And I strongly recommend this to EFC, Daphne, Philea, as the new name is, and the EBPA as well, to fight for this common law.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Marcus. It looks like when it gets to kind of enabling cross-border collaboration and facilitating, enlarging the toolbox, indeed, there is a call on the philanthropic infrastructure, EFC, Daphne, EVPA. So indeed, that's very important that we join forces there to make sure that processes and the operating framework is enabling. So I have a sense that we could continue quite a bit longer on this topic. We just were able to touch some of the questions we wanted to discuss with you. I now have the pleasure and privilege to quickly summarize some of the key points, which is indeed challenging. And I thank all the panelists for their great interventions. I heard with regard to experience during the pandemic, which, as we understand, is not over, that there's been a move towards more flexibility of activities of foundations. So some foundations were not used to work also on emergency relief, but they set up new focuses to deal with the emergency situation, while there otherwise sometimes are on the long-term perspective. Many of the foundations have indeed changed also the functions, the processes, and flexibility indeed is a big term there that I heard through all your points, and the move towards unrestricted funding in specifically this situation that we had in the COVID. The speed was also mentioned, the need to react quickly, and the way you enable that within your own processes. Then a second point I heard was indeed trust and a different approach and collaboration with partners to find solutions, to provide funding for in these difficult times. Again, this is of course needed also with regard to simplification of some of the processes, but also that the trust element was really key also to keep on going, and to consider also that sometimes there was a bit of humility and respect mentioned. These were words that I also heard in the conversation today as terms in the crisis situation. Then the third element I wanted to highlight, it's indeed collaboration, new ways of collaborations. Multilateral, cross-cutting, intersectional, also different departments dealing with grant making, with impact investing, and also collaborations among foundations. However, I also heard that it led sometimes to a more local focus. So there may have been a little downside when it gets to cross-border activities and collaborations. So that is something that is potentially now really again back on the rise. but also a point around pooled funding that may have also been a bit more difficult during the actual direct crisis time, but there is now more move towards that. So I sense that there was a call also for further thinking about the toolbox, the different approaches, diversity of the foundation sector, and indeed the different approaches that there are at the disposal for foundations. And we understand that sometimes the laws make it a bit more difficult, so there is a call for a more operating environment space, but there is also a call for talking about using tools and platforms such as this group to exchange views, to exchange ideas, and to share good practice and learn from each other. And I think that's an important task also, of course, for us, for EFC, EVPA, and the wider infrastructure to continue the conversations, provide a safe space for conversations like this, and to also raise the profile of new approaches, impact investing. We sense that there is more room for further discussing and exchanging among the wider foundation community. So thank you all for having this great discussion and debate. And I pass over for a final word of reflection to Alessia from EVPA. And over to you, Alessia.
Yes, so thank you so much to the participants for staying with us, for the question received, and of course, once more, thank you, Marco, Boan, Francisco, and Marcus, and thank you, your organizations. I also would like to tell you that in this group, there are more foundations, so I would like also to name them now. So it's Fondazione Cerretti, Fondazione Compagnia di San Paolo from Italy, Botnar Foundation from Switzerland, Oranje Fonds from the Netherlands, and also Kimbad One Foundation from Belgium. And while I'll put on the slides for the next sessions, I also would like to thank our colleague Peter Kafferkey, who is always in this journey with us and also an active panelist of today. So as Anna said, I think that this collaboration among our organizations and these 9 innovative and large foundations really show the potential of sharing best practices and think through. So as you can see, there will be in 2 minutes another track of sessions, 3 sessions in parallel. And then, of course, I would like to thank everyone and say that this event is part of what we call Impact Month, a challenging journey of EVPA, and we would like to thank our sponsors. So without further ado, I'll give you the time to go and prepare for the next sessions. Thank you again, Marco, Marcus, Boan, and Francisco, and thank you, Hannah, for moderating this panel with me.